Good morning. This is Alex Mercer, and you are listening to the National Emergency Radio Network. It is early morning on the American East Coast, and in the past 90 minutes, something has begun moving through the global financial system that our senior analysts are describing. And I want to choose this word with precision, as unprecedented. What we are tracking is not a correction. It is not a liquidity event in the traditional sense of that phrase. What we are observing across multiple simultaneous data feeds from the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and the People's Bank of China, is a cascading, simultaneous collapse in confidence in the United States dollar as a reserve currency and as a functioning medium of exchange. In the past hour and 32 minutes, the dollar index has fallen from an overnight position of 94.2 to below 58. Our instruments were not designed to record a move of that velocity. Currency trading desks in Tokyo, Frankfurt, Singapore, and London have suspended operations. The New York Stock Exchange has not yet opened. We do not know if it will open today. We are going to be on the air for as long as this takes. Stay with us.
Alex, before we go further into the data, I want to make sure that the people listening to us right now in their kitchens, in their cars, in their workplaces, understand what this means at the level of the sidewalk. Because we are already receiving messages. In the past 40 minutes, our inbox has received over 1,800 messages from listeners across the continental United States, and they are telling us the same thing in different words. A woman in Columbus, Ohio writes, "I went to the ATM this morning to get money for groceries. The machine said my account had a zero balance. I called the bank. There was no answer. I have 3 children at home." A man in Louisville, Kentucky writes, "My employer tried to run payroll this morning and the system rejected the transaction. Nobody knows what to tell us." These are not edge cases. These are not panicking people. These are ordinary people who encountered the system this morning and found that it did not work. We are going to hold those people in mind for everything that follows on this broadcast.
To provide the structural context that our listeners need, the United States dollar has served as the world's primary reserve currency since the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944. In practical terms, this means that approximately 60% of all foreign exchange reserves held by the world's central banks are denominated in US dollars. Approximately 42% of all international trade transactions are settled in dollars, regardless of whether the United States is involved in the trade. The dollar underpins global commodity pricing, from crude oil to wheat to copper. It underpins the international banking system through its role in correspondent banking. It underwrites the credit systems that move ships, planes, trucks, and cargo across every border in the world. When we say the dollar is collapsing, we are therefore not describing a situation analogous to, for example, the devaluation of the Argentine peso or the Turkish lira. We are describing a structural failure in the foundation of the entire global economic architecture. And I want to be clear, we have not been in this territory before. There is no historical playbook.
2 hours in now. I want to read you something from a truck driver named Marcus, who is hauling refrigerated cargo on Interstate 65 in northern Alabama. He says he pulled into a fuel depot at a truck stop and was told by the manager that the facility was no longer accepting dollar-denominated payment. The manager told him, and I'm reading this directly, "We don't know what it's worth right now. Come back when we know what we're dealing with." Marcus says he's sitting in his cab. He has about a quarter tank of diesel. There are 11 other rigs in that parking lot in the same situation. Refrigerated cargo. He is carrying produce from farms in Florida destined for grocery distribution centers in Chicago. He says some of the other drivers are calling their dispatchers and getting no answers. He says, "I've never felt less certain of anything in my professional life, and I've driven through 2 hurricanes." Marcus, we hear you, and we want people to understand that what Marcus is sitting in right now is not a trucking problem. It is the beginning of a supply chain problem, and supply chains are how food moves, and how medicine moves, and how everything that keeps a civilization functional moves.
We are now confirming that the New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ Exchange, and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange have all invoked emergency circuit breaker and trading halt protocols simultaneously. This is the first time in the recorded history of American financial markets that all three major exchanges have suspended operations at the same moment outside of an explicit act of war or national disaster. The Federal Reserve has released a statement, and I'm going to read it in full because it is notable for what it contains and what it does not contain. Quote, "The Federal Reserve is monitoring conditions in global financial markets with the utmost attention and is in active consultation with the United States Department of the Treasury, the International Monetary Fund, and central bank counterparts in the G7 and G20 groupings. The Federal Reserve remains committed to its mandate of supporting financial stability and will take all necessary measures within its authority to support the integrity of the USS financial system. Further statements will follow as circumstances allow." End of statement. Our listeners who are experienced in reading central bank language will note that this statement contains no specific reassurances, no specific policy commitments, and no timeline. That is not an accident. Central banks do not omit things accidentally.
2.5 hours in, I want to address something that I am seeing in our message flow that needs to be named. There are people who are, right now, making decisions based on what they're hearing, and some of those decisions are good, and some of them may not be. A listener in Phoenix, Arizona, writes that she drove to 3 different ATMs in her neighborhood and withdrew the maximum amount from each one. She writes, "I feel like I'm doing something wrong, but I also feel like I'm being rational and I don't know which one is true." I want to speak to that directly. What she is describing is rational behavior in a crisis of this kind. Physical cash, even a dollar that is under extreme pressure, retains more immediate utility than a number on a screen that you cannot access. At the same time, I want to say what our financial correspondent is telling us. The FDIC insurance framework is a legal instrument. It has not been suspended. Bank account balances have not been wiped out by fiat. What we are dealing with is a transaction processing crisis and a valuation crisis, not yet a legal dissolution of the banking system. Those are different problems and they call for different responses. Stay calm, make reasonable decisions, check on your neighbors.
3 hours in, we are getting our first international picture with enough clarity to describe it coherently. In South Korea, the Bank of Korea has suspended all foreign exchange operations indefinitely. The Korean won, which was already under pressure in overnight trading, fell 31% against the euro before trading was halted. The Korea Composite Stock Price Index, the KOSPI, opened this morning and fell 19% in the first 8 minutes before circuit breakers activated. In Tokyo, where markets were already open when the main cascade began overnight, the Nikkei fell 27% over the course of approximately 90 minutes before Japanese regulators suspended all trading. The Bank of Japan convened an emergency meeting of its policy board at 4 o'clock in the morning local time. Their statement, issued roughly an hour ago, called the situation, and I'm quoting their official English translation, "a systemic shock of an order not previously encountered in the post-war monetary order." For an institution as measured as the Bank of Japan, that language represents an extraordinary departure from normal communication protocol. We are also tracking significant developments in Frankfurt, in Zurich, and in London. We will return to those in a moment.
3 hours and 20 minutes in, the phone lines that we have open for listener calls have been candidly impossible to manage. We've taken a few. A retired school teacher named Dorothy is calling from Scottsdale, Arizona. Dorothy, thank you for being with us. Dorothy says she's 71 years old and she has lived through the savings and loan crisis, through 2008, through every financial disruption of the past 50 years. She says, both times before the bad thing happened and then people came in and fixed it. What I'm not hearing today is anyone saying who is going to fix it and how. And that is what is scaring me more than anything else. Dorothy, I want to tell you that your question is the correct question, and we don't have a complete answer for it yet. What we can say is that the Federal Reserve, the IMF, and the G7 governments are all in emergency session right now, and the question they are trying to answer is exactly the one you just asked. But I will not pretend that reassurance I cannot verify is worth anything to you. You deserve honesty, and the honest answer is we don't know yet.
4 hours in. We can now begin to describe what our financial intelligence community believes is the triggering mechanism for what we are experiencing. And I want to be very precise. Causation at this scale is rarely singular, and the full picture will take weeks or months to reconstruct. But what our sources are now converging on is a coordinated divestment, executed in near-perfect synchrony by the sovereign wealth funds of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, and Norway, beginning at approximately 2:47 Eastern Time this morning. These 5 funds collectively held roughly $3.8 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities as of last reported positions. Our sources indicate that those positions were liquidated or initiated for liquidation over a window of less than 100 minutes, moving assets into a pre-positioned alternative reserve instrument designed and quietly constructed over the past 4 years by a consortium anchored by China, Russia, Brazil, India, and South Africa. This instrument, internally designated the Distributed Reserve Unit, was apparently engineered to reach a threshold of systemic irreversibility before any Western counteraction could be organized. We are now getting confirmation from intelligence sources that this action did not begin today. It began approximately 48 months ago in the meeting rooms of finance ministries whose participants knew exactly what they were building.
4.5 hours in, I need to take a moment to address what is happening in American hospitals right now, because we have a correspondent who has been inside a major medical center in Baltimore since before dawn, and what she is describing matters. Hospital systems run on software. That software runs on financial rails. Insurance authorization systems, pharmaceutical supply order systems, payroll processing, equipment maintenance contract systems. Those rails are all dollar-denominated clearing systems, and those systems are, in her words, going gray. She says automated medication dispensing units are refusing to complete transactions because they cannot confirm insurance authorization. She says the hospital administrator sent an all-staff message 40 minutes ago instructing clinical personnel to shift to paper-based authorization protocols. Paper-based. That means manually written medication orders, manually logged dosage records. The nursing staff and physician staff are adapting, she says. These protocols exist for exactly this kind of emergency, but she describes the atmosphere in the hallways as very quiet and very fast. People doing their jobs under conditions they trained for but hoped never to encounter. She says, nobody has panicked, but nobody has smiled today either.
5 hours in now. The U.S. Department of Defense has confirmed that American military forces have moved to DEFCON 3. I want to walk through what that means with precision, because the terminology matters. DEFCON 3 is the third of 5 readiness levels. It indicates increased force readiness above normal peacetime posture. It does not indicate that offensive military action is being considered or that nuclear forces have been placed on elevated alert. DEFCON 3 was last activated following the September 11th attacks. The most probable rationale for this activation is the protection of critical domestic infrastructure, the maintenance of command and control communications, and preparation for the possibility of civil unrest in major metropolitan areas. The National Guard has been placed on standby in 22 states. The governors of California, Texas, New York, Florida, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Ohio have all signed emergency declarations in the past 2 hours. Those declarations unlock federal emergency assistance provisions and give governors extraordinary authority over state resources. What I want to emphasize is this: the governmental structure of the United States remains intact. Congress is in session. The judiciary is functioning. The executive branch is operating. The collapse we are tracking is a financial collapse, not a governmental one. And the distinction matters enormously.
5.5 hours in, we are receiving word from our correspondent in suburban New Jersey that she is watching the parking lots of multiple grocery stores from her car, and she wants to describe what she is seeing without sensationalism because she says she thinks it's important. She says the stores are open. She says the people in those stores are not panicking in the sense of running or screaming or fighting. She says they are moving very purposefully and very quietly. She says the store she is watching has positioned employees at the entrances to manage the volume and that customers are being admitted in groups. She says one store has put up a handwritten sign at the register that says cash only. Card machines temporarily unavailable. She says people are reading the sign. Some of them are leaving to find cash. Some of them are proceeding with what they have. She describes the atmosphere as what she would call organized fear. People who know something is very wrong and are behaving rationally in response to it. She says, "The thing that strikes me is how quiet it is. I expected noise. I'm hearing almost no voices at all, just carts and footsteps."
6 hours in, the international picture is developing quickly, and I need to give you the full contour of what we are now tracking. In Europe, Germany and France have convened an emergency joint session of their respective finance ministers, and the European Central Bank has announced it is activating emergency liquidity provisions for Eurozone banks under Article 18.1 of the ECB statute. The euro itself has come under significant pressure. It has fallen 14% against gold in Frankfurt, trading this morning. The United Kingdom has convened an emergency session of Parliament, and the Bank of England has suspended dollar-denominated foreign exchange operations. In the Asia-Pacific region beyond Japan and South Korea, Australia has announced a temporary halt to dollar-denominated commodity export settlements. The Australian dollar, paradoxically, has strengthened slightly as traders view hard commodity-backed currencies as relatively safer. In Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia have all moved to suspend dollar settlements and are attempting bilateral yuan-denominated trade arrangements with China. In South Asia, Pakistan has declared a national economic emergency. Bangladesh's central bank has frozen all international dollar transactions. India's Reserve Bank has convened an emergency board session, but has not yet released a statement, which our analysts interpret as active deliberation rather than paralysis.
7 hours in, I want to return to the human picture because I think it is easy for our listeners to feel that what they are hearing is abstract. Numbers falling, institutions pausing, governments convening. Let me tell you about what is happening on the ground in Detroit, Michigan, where our local radio partners are reporting conditions that deserve attention. Fuel stations throughout the metropolitan area are running low on supply, not because supply isn't physically available, but because the commercial systems that govern fuel delivery, the contracts, the insurance, the settlement mechanisms, are all dollar denominated, and most of them have effectively frozen. The fuel that exists in underground tanks is finite. Station owners are making individual decisions about whether and how to continue operations. Our partner reporter says she has found 3 stations still operating on a cash-only basis with lines that extend into the street. She has found 2 stations that have posted closed signs and locked their pumps. And she has found 1 station owner, a man she describes as perhaps 60 years old, who is sitting in a lawn chair next to his pump with a handwritten sign that says, "Fill up, pay whatever you can." She asked him why. He said, "People need to get home. I'll figure out the money part later."
8 hours in. I want to walk through the secondary cascade that our infrastructure analysts are now tracking, because it is essential to understanding how a financial crisis translates into a physical infrastructure crisis. Power grid operators in the northeastern United States use spot pricing markets to balance supply and demand in real time. Those spot pricing markets are denominated in dollars and settled through electronic clearing systems. Those clearing systems are currently non-functional. PJM Interconnection, which manages electrical grid operations for approximately 65 million people across 13 states and the District of Columbia, has moved to manual load balancing protocols. Grid engineers are performing by hand calculations and communications that are normally automated. The grid is staying on. I want to be clear about that. But it is staying on through human effort that cannot be indefinitely sustained at current intensity. The same pattern is playing out in water treatment facilities in every major American city. The chemicals used to treat municipal water, chlorine, fluoride, coagulants, are procured through automated supply contracts. Those contracts are dollar denominated. The chemicals in the treatment facilities today are sufficient. The replenishment mechanisms for those chemicals are impaired. We are not facing an immediate water safety crisis. We may face one in 10 to 14 days if the underlying problems are not resolved.
9 hours in. I have been on the air for the better part of this entire event, and I want to tell you about something that happened in our studio an hour ago that I have been turning over in my mind. A member of our technical staff, a young man, 24 years old, from Queens, New York, walked into the booth between segments and quietly placed a folded piece of paper on my desk. It was a handwritten note from his mother. She had called him while he was working, and he had transcribed what she said because he thought we should read it. With his permission, she wrote, "Tell whoever is listening that I am sitting on my front stoop in Jamaica, Queens, and my neighbor, Mrs. Okafor, came out and we didn't say anything about any of this. We just sat together. And then Mr. Reyes from across the street came out. And then the Williamson family from next door. And by 9 o'clock, there were 11 of us sitting on our stoops and the sidewalk, and nobody was talking about the news. We were just being where the other people were. I don't know why I needed to tell someone that, but it felt important. I think it is important. I think it may be one of the most important things I have read today."
10 hours in. We now have, for the first time, mortality data that can be directly attributed to crisis conditions. I want to handle this with the gravity it deserves. The American College of Emergency Physicians has released a preliminary statement indicating that emergency departments in 17 major American cities are reporting a pattern of what they call infrastructure contingent mortality events. These are deaths that occurred because systems that should have functioned did not function. A dialysis patient in Houston who could not access their scheduled treatment because the dialysis center's automated supply and payment systems failed. An insulin-dependent diabetic in Minneapolis who ran out of medication because the pharmacy's reorder system could not complete a transaction. 3 cardiac patients in the Baltimore area whose ambulance dispatch was delayed because the regional dispatch coordination software experienced a payment system-related authentication failure. These are the earliest numbers, 17 confirmed deaths in the United States that our correspondents can trace directly to the infrastructure failures that began this morning. 17 people. I am going to say that number plainly and not move past it too quickly. 17 people died this morning because systems failed.
11 hours in. We have a call, a real voice call, from a nurse in Cleveland, Ohio. Her name is Angela. She has agreed to speak to us for a few minutes. Angela, you're on National Emergency Radio Network. Tell us where you are and what you're seeing. Angela says she has been on shift since 6 this morning, which means she has been working for 5 hours since the crisis began in earnest. She works in an intensive care unit. She says the hospital is operating and that her patients are being cared for. She says the paper-based protocols are functioning, but they are slower. And in an ICU, slower has consequences that faster does not have. She says that in the past 2 hours, she has had to make decisions about medication dosage sequencing, decisions that the automated systems normally flag and cross-check, that she is now making with a pen and a paper chart and her own clinical knowledge. She says, I went to nursing school for 4 years. I did my residency. I know how to do this job without the software, but I want whoever is in charge of all of this to understand that the software wasn't a luxury. The software was there because the work is hard and humans make mistakes when they're tired and there's no backup. Angela, thank you. Please keep going. We are grateful for you.
12 hours in. The global picture is now resolving with a clarity that is, in some ways, worse than the uncertainty of the early hours. Several patterns have established themselves with enough consistency that we can describe them with confidence. The first pattern, in wealthy, diversified economies, Germany, Japan, Canada, Australia, financial crisis is translating into severe economic disruption, but not yet into humanitarian emergency. Supply chains are impaired, not broken. Banks are restricted, not dissolved. Governments are functioning and deploying significant resources. The second pattern, in middle-income economies with high dollar exposure, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Egypt, Argentina, Nigeria, Turkey, the crisis is translating much faster into humanitarian conditions. Currency values have essentially become notional. Import-dependent food systems are experiencing the first signs of supply stress. Governments are attempting to manage but have fewer tools. The third pattern, in the most vulnerable economies, Yemen, Haiti, South Sudan, Mozambique, where populations were already living at or below the humanitarian threshold, dollar-denominated aid infrastructure has collapsed in a matter of hours. The World Food Program has issued an emergency flash alert stating that its operations in 7 countries are suspended. Those are countries where WFP food is not supplementing nutrition. It is providing nutrition, and it has stopped.
12 and a half hours in, I need to name what Alex just described because I think the language of economics can unintentionally obscure what we are actually talking about. When Alex says the World Food Program operations have suspended in 7 countries, he is saying that there are children in Yemen, in South Sudan, in Haiti, who are going to receive food today and will not receive food today. Not because the food disappeared, not because the trucks broke down, but because the financial instruments that coordinated its delivery, the letters of credit, the insurance bonds, the currency settlement systems, have stopped working. They were working yesterday. They are not working today. And the gap between yesterday and today for a child who is already malnourished is not an abstract gap. It is a physical, immediate, dangerous gap. I want our listeners to carry that. The people most hurt by this crisis are not the ones with the most dollars. They are the ones who had almost no dollars to begin with and who were still somehow within reach of a system that tried to help them. That system is now impaired, and the people it was almost reaching are the first to feel it.
14 hours in. I want to update our listeners on the governmental response with as much precision as possible. The President of the United States delivered a brief statement from the Oval Office approximately 40 minutes ago. I will read the full text. Quote, "My fellow Americans, we are facing a financial crisis without precedent in our history. The dollar is under severe pressure in global markets due to a coordinated action by foreign sovereign wealth funds and governments who have been working for years to construct an alternative to our financial system. I will not mislead you. The path through this will be difficult, and it will not be short. But I want to be direct about what we are doing. I am directing the Treasury Department to implement emergency bank stabilization measures guaranteeing all domestic deposits. I am activating FEMA's emergency food distribution network in all 50 states effective immediately. I am signing an executive order establishing temporary price controls on essential utilities, electricity, water, natural gas, and home heating oil, to ensure that no American loses heat or power in the coming weeks due to payment system disruptions. And I am directing the Secretary of the Treasury to begin negotiations immediately with our international partners on a framework for global monetary reconstruction. We have faced hard days before. We will face this one together. I ask for your patience, your steadiness, and your care for one another. End of statement.
We are now 22 hours into this, approaching a full day. I've been on and off air for most of it, and I want to take a moment to say something about what the overnight hours in America look like, because they were not what I feared. I feared violence. I feared breakdowns. What I heard about from our correspondents and from the messages that kept coming into this studio through every hour of the night was something different. A woman in rural Tennessee who opened her barn and invited 3 families she barely knew to sleep in it because they were stranded without fuel. A pharmacist in Portland, Oregon, who called every patient in his records who depended on insulin and drove to their homes personally with enough supply to last 2 weeks, using his own car and his own money. A retired police officer in Cleveland who organized an informal neighborhood patrol, not to protect property, he told our correspondent, but to make sure that elderly people on his block knew someone was watching. These things happened. They are documented, and they happened all night, in every city, in every town, in every situation where one person saw that another person needed something and did the thing that needed doing.
Day 2. We are 26 hours in. Let me give a structured update on where things stand. Domestically, approximately 35% of gas stations in the continental United States have either suspended operations or shifted to cash-only transactions with limited supply. Major grocery chains are operating under emergency protocols with purchase limits on high-demand categories. Hospital networks in 14 states are on paper-based operational protocols. Power grids remain operational with manual intervention. The FEMA Emergency Food Distribution Network is activating at county fairgrounds, high school parking lots, military bases, and National Guard armories across all 50 states. The first distributions are expected to begin in the early afternoon today. Internationally, overnight, France and Germany have formally invoked the European Union's Mutual Defense Solidarity provisions for economic emergency. The IMF has convened an emergency extraordinary session of its executive board. Japan and South Korea have released a joint statement proposing a Pacific economic stability framework. China's government has released a single statement acknowledging the situation and pledging stability in regional economic relationships. The word stability in that context, given that China participated in the construction of the distributed reserve unit that triggered this crisis, is being read very carefully by diplomats in every capital on Earth.
Day 2, 28 hours in. I want to spend time on the ports because the ports are where this crisis will become visible to every American in a very tangible way over the coming weeks, and I don't think enough has been said about it yet. The Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach, which together handle approximately 40% of all containerized imports entering the United States, have suspended commercial operations, not because the physical infrastructure failed. The cranes are working. The berths are available. The longshore workers showed up for their shifts. The ports are suspended because the financial instruments that govern the movement of cargo, letters of credit, marine insurance bonds, cargo settlement systems, are all denominated in dollars and processed through systems that are currently non-functional. There are approximately 340 container ships at anchor in the approaches to Los Angeles and Long Beach right now, loaded with cargo that cannot legally be transferred. The manifest of that cargo, our correspondent has reviewed some of it. pharmaceuticals manufactured in India, electronics components from Taiwan, automotive parts from Germany, children's clothing from Vietnam, all of it sitting offshore, 6 miles from a functioning civilization, unreachable.
Day 2. 32 hours in. The death toll within the United States from infrastructure contingent mortality events has risen. The American College of Emergency Physicians, in coordination with the CDC, has released a new estimate. As of this hour, the confirmed death toll directly attributable to healthcare and infrastructure system failures since the crisis began stands at 214. I want to walk through what that number represents. It includes dialysis patients who could not receive scheduled treatments. It includes emergency cases where dispatch coordination systems failed. It includes post-surgical patients in hospitals that lost automated monitoring support. It includes a number. Our correspondent says the CDC will not provide a precise figure yet, of people who were already in fragile health, who were managing conditions in a system that had already reduced their margin, and for whom one failure in one part of the system was one failure too many. 214 is not a large number compared to what war or famine produces, but it represents something specific. These are people who were alive yesterday because a system worked, and who are not alive today because that same system stopped working. That is a category of death we have to be clear-eyed about.
Day 2, 36 hours in. There is a story developing in the city of New Orleans that I want to tell you because I think it is one of the most human stories to emerge from this event so far. The Port of New Orleans, like every other major American port, suspended operations on day 1. But by the afternoon of day 1, the port director, a woman our correspondent identifies only as the director, made a decision. She called a meeting. She gathered union representatives, shipping company liaisons, customs officers, and terminal operators. And she made them a proposal. She said, "We know what is on these ships. We know that our city is going to need what is on these ships. The financial systems are broken, so we are going to work on trust. We are going to move cargo on handshake agreements with IOS and paper records, and we are going to settle the financial accounts later when the systems are restored." The union representatives caucused for 20 minutes. They came back and said yes. Customs officers called their supervisors. The supervisors said yes. The Port of New Orleans began partial operations yesterday evening. 40% of normal capacity, paper ledgers, cash payments for labor, promises for everything else. The director told our correspondent, "We don't have time for the paper to work perfectly. We have time to make the right thing happen."
Day 3. 72 hours from the first reports. I want to give a comprehensive update on the international humanitarian situation because the picture is now clear enough and grim enough to require direct address. The countries experiencing the most severe conditions are those that were already operating at the margins of functional stability. In Lebanon, which was already a failed state by most economic metrics before this crisis began, the situation has descended into what aid organizations are calling a total monetary void. There is no functioning currency. Barter has replaced commerce in most of Beirut. Water distribution in the capital is being managed manually by municipal workers who are not being paid. In Sri Lanka, which experienced a severe debt crisis several years before this event, the IMF structural adjustment framework that was barely sustaining economic function has collapsed entirely. The Sri Lankan president addressed the nation last night and called for international humanitarian intervention. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, specifically in Mali, Burkina Faso, and the Central African Republic, where governments were already marginal and dollar-denominated aid was the principal source of food for large portions of the population. The withdrawal of that aid has created conditions that the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs is describing as acute humanitarian emergency.
Day 3, 74 hours in. We have, throughout this broadcast, been reading messages from listeners in America. I want to expand that lens now to the messages we are receiving from international correspondents and listeners, because the rest of the world is inside this, too. A teacher in Dhaka, Bangladesh writes, I teach 63 children in a school that operates on funding from an international NGO. Yesterday, we received word that the NGO's bank accounts are frozen in a New York bank that is under restrictions. We have no money to pay teachers, to buy food for the school lunch program, to pay for the facility. I came to school anyway today. Most of my colleagues came. We taught class. We made sure the children had something to eat from what we brought from our own homes. We will come back tomorrow, but I need someone to tell us how long this can go on. I don't have an answer for that teacher in Dhaka. I wish I did. But I want that teacher's voice on this broadcast because the story of this crisis is not only what is happening in American parking lots and American hospital wards, it is what is happening in classrooms in Bangladesh and clinics in Mali and fishing communities in Haiti and everywhere that the dollar's collapse falls hardest on people who had nothing to do with building the system that just failed them.
Day 4. 96 hours in. The International Monetary Fund has released its first comprehensive assessment of the crisis. The document is 47 pages, and I am going to summarize its core findings. First, the IMF confirms that the triggering mechanism was the coordinated divestment of U.S. Treasury holdings by the sovereign wealth funds of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, and Norway, combined with the simultaneous activation of the Distributed Reserve Unit by the BRICS Plus coalition. The IMF characterizes this as a, quote, deliberately engineered confidence cascade designed to reach systemic irreversibility before defensive countermeasures could be organized. Second, the IMF estimates that global economic output will contract by between 12 and 18% over the next 12 months, which would be the largest single-year contraction in recorded global economic history, exceeding the declines of 1929 and 2020. Third, the IMF is proposing a transitional international reserve compact, a basket currency system combining the euro, the Chinese yuan, the Japanese yen, and a new synthetic commodity-backed instrument, with the US dollar remaining in the basket at approximately 14% weighting, reduced from its current 60% dominance. Implementation timeline, 24 to 36 months. Fourth, the IMF projects, and I am going to read this figure directly, quote, cumulative mortality attributable to the crisis event, including healthcare infrastructure failure and humanitarian supply chain disruption, is projected to reach between 500,000 and 1.2 million deaths globally over a 12-month period, with the highest concentrations in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa.
Day 4, 100 hours in. I just read the IMF projection that Alex cited. 500,000 to 1.2 million people. I want to sit with that number for a moment because I think it is possible to hear a number that large and have it become abstract. So let me try to make it concrete. The projection means that for every day that passes with the supply chain infrastructure impaired, the people who were closest to the edge of what they needed to survive move closer to the edge they were already near. It means a child in Yemen who is receiving nutritional supplements through a WFP program that has suspended operations will, within days, begin to experience the physical effects of that absence. It means a tuberculosis patient in South Sudan who depended on a medication supply chain that ran through a dollar clearing system will, within days, face the progression of a disease that the medication was holding at bay. 500,000 to 1.2 million is not an abstraction. It is the arithmetic of people who needed a system to keep working and are now in a world where it has stopped. And we are 4 days in.
Day 5. 118 hours in. The G20 has convened in a virtual emergency summit, its first extraordinary summit in 4 years. The communiqué that emerged from the first session is significant, and I am going to read key portions. Quote, "The G20 recognizes that the current crisis represents a fundamental discontinuity in the international monetary system and calls for the immediate establishment of a multilateral working group to design and implement a successor reserve architecture. The G20 endorses in principle the framework proposed by the International Monetary Fund for a basket currency international reserve compact. The G20 calls for an immediate 90-day moratorium on all sovereign debt acceleration claims and all cross-border financial litigation to provide space for restructuring negotiations. The G20 calls on all member governments to maintain the free flow of essential humanitarian goods, food, medicine, fuel for heating and cooking, across national borders during the restructuring period, and commits to providing mutual assistance to member governments whose humanitarian systems are at risk of failure." End quote. This is a statement with real significance. The moratorium on sovereign debt claims alone prevents a cascade of legal actions that could have locked up international finance in litigation for years. The commitment to humanitarian good flows is a recognition that people are dying and that governments have a collective responsibility to address that.
Day 5, 120 hours in. I want to tell you about something happening in American cities that I think deserves its own moment. In the days since this began, a network of organizations that exist in the spaces between government and market has activated at a scale that I don't think anyone predicted. Community food banks, which were already operating before this event, have tripled their distribution capacity in most major cities. In Chicago, the Greater Chicago Food Depository has moved from serving approximately 150,000 people per week to serving an estimated 380,000 people, using a combination of FEMA partnership distributions, donated inventory from food companies whose supply chains are impaired and who cannot move product, and volunteer labor that has simply shown up and kept showing up. A similar pattern is visible in Los Angeles, in Houston, in Philadelphia, in Atlanta. The mutual aid networks that formed during the pandemic years and stayed formed are functioning. The community gardens that were planted in empty lots during those same years are producing food that is being given away. The neighborhood associations and faith communities and informal networks that never showed up in any economic model of how a society functions are turning out to be exactly the part of the infrastructure that the economic models were missing.
Day 6, 144 hours in. 1 full week. I want to give our listeners a comprehensive status report calibrated to what we know versus what we are still uncertain about. What we know, the US dollar is currently trading in limited resumption of foreign exchange markets at approximately 34% of its pre-crisis value against the euro and 31% against a basket of major currencies. This is not a recovery. This is a settling at a new, much lower level. The Federal Reserve has announced it will not attempt to defend the dollar's pre-crisis value and will instead focus on maintaining the dollar's utility as a domestic medium of exchange. Globally, 23 nations have suspended their central bank operations or moved to emergency provisional monetary frameworks. The nations in greatest structural distress, meaning those where economic recovery to pre-crisis function is considered uncertain even over a 5-year horizon, are Lebanon, Sri Lanka, Venezuela, Haiti, Yemen, and several small Pacific island nations whose GDP was almost entirely dependent on dollar-denominated tourism. The American death toll directly attributable to the crisis is now at 6,712 confirmed. The global toll from humanitarian supply chain failure is estimated at 90,000, with that number expected to rise significantly over the coming weeks.
Day 6, we are 1 week in. I want to address something that has been building in our message flow for several days and that I think deserves direct acknowledgement. There are listeners who have written to us in anger, not at us, at the institutions whose failure created this crisis. And I understand that anger. It is not irrational. What happened was not a natural disaster. It was not an asteroid or an earthquake or a virus. It was a decision. It was a set of decisions made by human beings in the offices of finance ministries and sovereign wealth funds and financial engineering firms over the course of years, with full awareness of what those decisions would ultimately produce. The suffering that is now occurring in Dhaka and in Sana'a and in Port-au-Prince and in the ICUs of American hospitals is the downstream consequence of those decisions. That is worth naming. It is worth sitting with. The anger at that fact is not misplaced. What I would ask, what I think the best of us asks in moments of justified anger, is that the anger be channeled into understanding and into demanding accountability and into building the successor system better. But the anger is real and it is earned, and we should not pretend otherwise.
Day 8, 192 hours in. I want to report on a development that may represent the most consequential positive step since the crisis began. The United States Treasury and the People's Bank of China have concluded a bilateral currency swap agreement, providing reciprocal access to each other's currencies, totaling the equivalent of approximately $400 billion. This is a transaction that would have been virtually inconceivable in the pre-crisis diplomatic environment. It is, in its way, one of the first concrete signs that the countries that helped engineer this crisis are also, however belatedly and however self-interestedly, willing to participate in stabilizing what their engineering produced. The currency swap does not restore the dollar. It does not reconstitute the pre-crisis monetary order. What it does is create a transactional bridge that allows some international trade to resume in dollar equivalents while the longer-term restructuring proceeds. Our economics correspondent says, think of it as a temporary road laid over a broken bridge. It doesn't fix the bridge, but it lets the trucks move. The trucks, in this metaphor, include food and medicine. And that matters right now more than anything else.
Day 9. I want to tell you about something that happened in a small town in Nebraska that I think carries meaning beyond itself. A wheat farmer named William, 63 years old, fourth generation, wrote us a letter. He writes, I want people to know that I planted my fields this week. The dollar might be 30 cents on the dollar right now. The bank is operating on some kind of provisional basis. My equipment dealer told me he doesn't know what his parts inventory is worth. None of that changes what needs to happen in spring. The wheat doesn't know about any of this. The soil doesn't know. I put the seed in the ground because that is what you do in spring. Because in 5 months there will be wheat, and people will need that wheat, whether or not we have figured out the money situation by then. I thought someone should say that out loud. The wheat is planted. William, we are saying it out loud. On the National Emergency Radio Network to everyone who is listening, the wheat is planted. And wherever you are, whatever it is that you do that produces something the world needs, whatever your version of the wheat is, please keep planting it, because the world is going to need it when we come through this.
Day 10, 240 hours, 10 full days. The death toll numbers are the hardest part of this report, and I am going to deliver them directly because our listeners deserve accuracy more than they deserve comfort. Within the United States, the confirmed death toll attributable to crisis-related infrastructure failures and healthcare system disruptions stands at 14,200. The largest categories: delayed medical care for time-sensitive conditions, primarily cardiac events, stroke, and dialysis dependency; medication supply chain failures, particularly for insulin, immunosuppressants, and oncology drugs; and a category the CDC is calling indirect mortality, deaths from exposure and accidents that occurred in the context of infrastructure disruption. including several hundred people in the Midwest who were without heat during a cold snap and could not access emergency services. Globally, the World Health Organization's best current estimate for crisis-related mortality, including humanitarian supply chain failure in the most affected nations, stands at 420,000. That number is rising at a rate of approximately 20,000 per week, with the steepest rate in the countries where aid operations were suspended in the first days of the crisis and have not been fully restored.
Day 11. I want to spend time today on something that has been unfolding quietly in American cities and that I think constitutes one of the most important social developments of this crisis period. Local currencies have been spontaneously created in at least 60 American cities. In Asheville, North Carolina, a coalition of local businesses and residents designed a currency called the Mountain Note within the first 4 days of the crisis, backed by a basket of locally produced goods, food, firewood, labor hours, and it has achieved such widespread local adoption that the Asheville city government has formally endorsed it as a supplement to the dollar for local transactions. In Detroit, a similar instrument emerged from the city's long-standing cooperative and mutual aid economy. In the rural Pacific Northwest, several county-level communities have established barter networks with formalized ledger systems. In each case, the people who built these systems were not economic theorists. They were hardware store owners and farmers and teachers and unemployed workers who needed a way to exchange value with their neighbors and improvised one. This is not a solution to the global crisis, but it is a demonstration of something that I think the global crisis has clarified. Communities that have relationships, that have trust, that know each other, can build systems. The dollar was a system. It is impaired, and people are building other systems. That is actually how systems get rebuilt.
Day 12. The negotiation of the International Reserve Compact has accelerated meaningfully. The IMF, working with the G20 Finance Ministers Working Group, has released a revised framework document. The key parameters. The new basket will consist of 6 constituent elements. The euro, weighted at 22%. The Chinese yuan at 20%. The Japanese yen at 16%. The Indian rupee at 12%, which represents a significant elevation of India's role in the global monetary architecture. The US dollar at 14%, reduced from its pre-crisis 60% dominance. And a commodity synthetic unit, backed by a basket including gold, silver, oil, natural gas, and 10 strategic rare earth metals, weighted at 16%. Implementation will proceed in 3 phases over 24 months. The United States has formally endorsed the framework, with a recorded dissent from 23 members of the Senate, who have introduced a resolution demanding renegotiation, though legal scholars indicate that treaty authority for monetary agreements rests with the executive. The Chinese government has endorsed the framework. Every other G20 member has endorsed it. The era of dollar hegemony is over. What comes next is, at least in principle, a more distributed and perhaps more resilient global monetary system. Whether it is also a more just one remains to be seen.
Day 13. I want to update our listeners on the situation in the countries that have suffered most severely, because I think it is important that those stories stay in our coverage, even as the narrative of American adaptation and international negotiation begins to dominate. In Yemen, the World Food Program has restored approximately 40% of its pre-crisis operational capacity through a combination of Chinese and European direct funding and the newly activated humanitarian carve-outs of the G20 communique. 40% is not sufficient, but it is not zero. In Sri Lanka, a coalition of Indian and Chinese emergency assistance teams is operating an airlift of essential medical supplies and food staples. The Sri Lankan government has accepted this assistance with significant domestic political complexity because the alternative was worse. In Lebanon, a coalition of European NGOs is working through informal barter and in-kind exchange systems to maintain water and food distribution in Beirut and the major cities. The situation is severe. It is not yet catastrophic in the sense of total state collapse, but it is one serious disruption away from crossing that line, and the people working to prevent it are doing so with very thin margins.
Day 15. We are now 2 weeks and 1 day into the event. The American economy has settled into what our analysts are calling crisis normal, a state of significantly impaired but functioning economic activity. Here is what that looks like in concrete terms. Approximately 65% of small businesses in the United States that were operating before the crisis are still operating, most of them on modified terms, cash heavy, with reduced inventory, with modified pricing that reflects the new dollar value environment. Major national grocery chains are operating at about 70% of pre-crisis capacity, with persistent shortages in categories dependent on imported goods, electronics, certain clothing categories, some pharmaceutical products. Fuel is available in most of the country, but at prices approximately 40% higher than pre-crisis due to the dollar's reduced purchasing power for international commodity prices. The Federal Emergency Food Distribution Network is feeding approximately 55 million Americans daily, down from a peak of about 70 million in the first week, as commercial food supply has partially recovered. The unemployment rate, by current estimates, has risen from 4.2% to approximately 16%, a level last seen in the depths of the Great Depression. But there is no soup line in the visual sense. There is a FEMA tent. There is a mutual aid table. There is a neighborhood that is feeding itself. It is not the same. But it is not 1932 either.
Day 16. We have been on the air in one form or another for 16 days. I want to say something personal, which I don't often do on this broadcast, but I think the moment calls for it. I have spent 16 days reading messages from people who are frightened and working to tell you the truth about what was happening without making the fear worse than the facts warranted. I've read you numbers that were terrible. I've read you names of countries that were suffering. I've read you letters from nurses and farmers and truck drivers and teachers and neighbors. And what I want to tell you today, on day 16, is this. The thing that has surprised me most about this crisis is not the systems that failed. It is the people who held. It is the nurse who stayed for 31 hours. It is the port director who restarted operations on handshakes. It is the farmer who planted his wheat. It is the woman in Queens whose neighbors came out and sat on the stoop together and did not need to talk about the news. Every single one of those things happened. They are documented. They are verified. And they happen because that is what people do, apparently. When the system cracks, people fill the crack with themselves. That is not nothing. That is actually everything.
Day 18. We are now approaching 3 weeks since the first cascade. The domestic death toll has stabilized in its rate of increase as the healthcare system has adapted to its new operational reality, and as medication supply chains have been partially restored through emergency bilateral agreements with India and Canada. The current domestic death toll stands at 22,400. The global toll stands at 680,000, according to WHO's latest estimate, with the rate of increase slowing as humanitarian aid operations are progressively restored. 680,000 is a number I need to say clearly. It is the largest single crisis event death toll in the 21st century, with the exception of the COVID-19 pandemic. Most of those deaths occurred in countries that were already impoverished, already fragile, already operating on thin margins that the loss of dollar-denominated aid and trade removed entirely. The full accounting of those deaths, and of the responsibility for them, is a conversation that the global community will have to have, and I believe must have, as the reconstruction period proceeds. But for now, I want to hold that number, 680,000. Those were lives.
Day 19. There is something I want to tell our listeners about the port situation because it has evolved in a way that I think is genuinely worth knowing. When we reported on the Port of New Orleans 2 weeks ago, the director who restarted operations on handshakes, we thought that was an exceptional story about one exceptional person. It has become a model. In the past 10 days, the Port of Houston, the Port of Savannah, the Port of Baltimore, and the Port of Seattle have all reopened under modified operational frameworks built on exactly the same principle. Move the goods, keep paper records, settle the financial accounts when the systems are restored. Port workers, customs officials, shipping company representatives, and government liaisons have sat at tables, shaken hands, and agreed to trust each other in the service of keeping things moving. It is not legally tidy. It will generate an enormous amount of financial and legal reconstruction work when normal systems resume. But the goods are moving. The pharmaceuticals from Indian manufacturers that were sitting offshore 3 weeks ago are now being unloaded. The automotive components from Germany are moving to assembly plants. The children's clothing from Vietnam is reaching the distribution centers. Trust, actual human trust between people who looked each other in the eye, turned out to be a functional substitute for the financial infrastructure that failed. That is a fact worth recording.
Day 21. 3 weeks. The international monetary restructuring is proceeding faster than the IMF's original timeline projected, largely because the alternative, continued uncertainty, is costing every economy on Earth more per day than the restructuring process itself. The Distributed Reserve Unit, the BRICS Plus instrument that triggered this crisis, is being folded into the International Reserve Compact framework. The political negotiations around this process are extraordinarily complex, and I will not pretend to represent their full nuance in a radio broadcast. What I can say is that the broad outlines of the new monetary architecture are becoming visible. The world will have a more distributed reserve system. The dollar will remain a significant but no longer dominant currency. American consumers will pay more for imported goods. The U.S. government will face structural constraints on its borrowing capacity that did not exist before this event. American geopolitical influence, which was deeply intertwined with dollar hegemony, will be diminished. These are profound changes to the country that most of our listeners live in. They are not the end of the country, but they are the end of a particular version of the country that has existed since 1945.
Day 22. I want to read something that came in 2 days ago, but that I have been carrying and that I want to share now. It's from a man who identifies himself as a retired central banker, 67 years old. He spent 30 years in international finance. He writes, "I knew, and I think most of my colleagues knew, that the system we had built was unsustainable. A single currency carrying the weight of the entire global economy, issued by a single government with domestic political pressures that had nothing to do with the needs of that global economy. We knew, and we built it anyway, because it was profitable, and because the alternatives were complicated, and because every year that we got away with it felt like a year we didn't have to face the reckoning. I owe an apology to the people in Bangladesh and Yemen and every other place that is paying for our recklessness. I don't know if an apology is enough. I know it isn't enough, but I wanted to say it on the air. I'm not going to comment on what he said. I'm just going to leave it there because I think it deserves to stand on its own."
Day 24. The Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach have resumed partial operations. I want to mark this moment because it represents, in a concrete and measurable way, the beginning of the reconnection of the American economy to the global supply chain. The terms are provisional and imperfect, a combination of cash transactions, government-backed letters of credit in euros and yuan, and the paper ledger trust system that the Port of New Orleans pioneered. But the cranes are moving. Container ships that have been at anchor for over 3 weeks are beginning to offload. The goods inside them, some of which are time-sensitive, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, certain food products, are being prioritized by a triage system that port operators, FEMA representatives, and HHS officials negotiated over 2 days of meetings. It is not the smooth, automated, financially optimized system that operated before this crisis. It is a human system. People with clipboards and radios and the authority to make judgment calls. It will work until the automated systems are rebuilt, and the automated systems will be rebuilt. Differently and with, I would hope, a recognition of what it means when they fail.
Day 26. We are in the final days of our first month of coverage. I want to share something that our producers flagged this morning that I think speaks to where we are. We received overnight approximately 400 listener messages, and for the first time since this began, the dominant tone of those messages was not fear. It was not despair. The dominant tone was something I would describe as determined exhaustion. People who are tired but still here. A social worker in Milwaukee who has been running an emergency assistance program for 3 weeks writes, "I haven't had a day off since this started. My feet hurt. My voice is gone from spending 8 hours a day on the phone. Last night I cried for an hour in my car. This morning I went back in." A grocery store manager in Atlanta writes, "We have been operating with a reduced staff on modified systems under purchase limits since day one. My staff has not complained once. Not once. They just show up and do the work. I don't know how to tell them what that means to me." A nurse in Seattle writes, "Angela from Cleveland, if you hear this, I heard your message on the radio 2 weeks ago. I thought of you every day since. I'm still here too."
Day 28. 2 days from the 1-month mark. I want to give a comprehensive assessment of the infrastructure status as we approach this milestone. Power grids, fully operational in all regions of the continental United States, though spot pricing remains on provisional manual frameworks. Water and sewage, fully operational with supply chain gaps for treatment chemicals being addressed through emergency federal procurement in alternative currencies. Telecommunications, fully operational, with internet infrastructure having proved more resilient than financial infrastructure throughout this event. Transportation. Trucking is at approximately 78% of pre-crisis capacity, with fuel available at elevated prices. Rail freight is at approximately 85%. Commercial aviation is at approximately 45% of pre-crisis capacity, as international routes remain partially suspended pending monetary framework stabilization. Ports are at 30 to 50% of pre-crisis capacity across the major facilities, improving weekly. Hospitals. All major hospital systems have returned to electronic-supported operations under interim payment frameworks. Mortality from healthcare infrastructure disruption has essentially ceased as a rate, though the cumulative toll is permanent. Overall domestic economic activity, estimated at approximately 55% of pre-crisis levels, with a trajectory towards 65 to 70% by end of month 2.
Day 29. Tomorrow we will reach the 1-month mark of this event. I want to spend a little time today with the countries that have suffered most, because I think they deserve more than a final accounting mention. Venezuela, which entered this crisis having already experienced years of hyperinflation and economic dysfunction, has been effectively demonetized. The bolivar had already failed as a currency before the dollar collapsed. The dollar was what kept Venezuela's import system minimally functional. Without it, the country is operating on a barter and resource extraction economy. The Venezuelan government has formally requested IMF receivership and is in negotiations. Sri Lanka, similarly, is in a managed international restructuring that will define its economic character for a generation. Lebanon has no functioning government and no recognized currency, and is surviving, barely, on international humanitarian assistance and remittances from its diaspora. Several small Pacific Island nations, whose entire economies were tourist dollar dependent, are facing a scenario that their governments are describing with honesty as potential state dissolution. Their populations are being resettled, primarily in New Zealand and Australia, under agreements that those governments have generously and rapidly extended. Those resettlements are, in the most literal sense, the transformation of communities that have existed for generations into diaspora communities. That is a profound loss. It should be recorded as such.
1 month. 30 days since the first reports emerged in the early morning hours of what was, until that morning, an ordinary day. I want to deliver the final accounting that our listeners deserve. The cause, what history will call the reserve crisis, or the dollar collapse, was not an accident and not a natural event. It was a deliberate geopolitical and economic action, 4 years in planning, executed by a coalition of sovereign wealth funds and central banks, operating under a coordinated strategy designed to dismantle the structural advantage that dollar hegemony conferred on the United States. The distributed reserve unit was the mechanism. The coordinated divestment of approximately $3.8 trillion in U.S. Treasury holdings over 90 minutes was the trigger. The confidence cascade that followed was the weapon. The architects of this action achieved their stated strategic objective, the end of dollar hegemony. They did so knowing with full actuarial clarity what the humanitarian cost of that achievement would be in the world's most vulnerable places. That knowledge, and what it says about the moral weight of geopolitical ambition, is a question that will occupy philosophers, jurists, and historians for the rest of this century.
1 month, the human cost. I'm going to read these numbers plainly, and I ask our listeners to hear them plainly. Within the United States, 26,412 confirmed deaths attributable to the crisis, primarily from healthcare infrastructure failure in the first 2 weeks before adaptation was complete. The majority of those deaths were among the elderly, the chronically ill, and people living in poverty who had the least margin when the system faltered. Globally, the World Health Organization's 30-day estimate stands at 780,000 deaths, with a projection that the final toll over 12 months will reach between 900,000 and 1.1 million, as the compounding effects of the crisis work through the most vulnerable populations. The nations structurally lost or permanently diminished. Lebanon, where state function will not recover without a generational reconstruction effort that has not yet begun. Sri Lanka, now under international receivership with an uncertain path to sovereignty. Venezuela, effectively stateless in economic terms. Several small Pacific Island nations whose populations are now in diaspora. Yemen, where the crisis layered onto pre-existing catastrophe and is expected to extend the conflict and humanitarian emergency by years. These are not footnotes. These are countries. These are peoples. These are histories and languages and communities and memories that have been damaged in ways that will not be repaired quickly, if at all.
1 month. What remains? The United States of America remains a functioning state with intact governmental institutions, a resilient civilian population, and an economy that has been severely damaged but not destroyed. The dollar remains a currency, diminished but present, participating in the new International Reserve Compact at 14% weighting. The Federal Reserve, the Treasury, and the Congress are functioning. The courts are open. The press is working. We are evidence of that. The American military has not been deployed domestically for offensive purposes, and its command authority remains civilian. The schools are open. The hospitals are caring for patients. The farms are planted. The trucks are moving. None of this means the road ahead is easy. American living standards will decline as the purchasing power implications of the dollar's new position work through the real economy. The federal government's capacity to run large deficits, to project global financial power, to impose economic conditions on the world through the privilege of issuing the reserve currency, that capacity is gone. The United States is now a large, important, but no longer uniquely dominant economy in a more multipolar world. That is the world our children will grow up in. It is not the worst world, but it is not the world that existed 31 days ago.
1 month. I want to give the ending that I can honestly give, and I want to give it in the words of the people who lived this alongside us. William, the farmer in Nebraska. The wheat is up. First green shoots this morning. I walked the whole north field. The social worker in Milwaukee. I took a day off yesterday, first one in a month. I slept for 11 hours and I cried again, and then I made myself a real breakfast and went back today. Angela, the nurse in Cleveland. My unit is fully staffed again. We're on electronic systems. We lost 2 patients in those first days who I think about every shift. I think about them the way you think about the people you couldn't save when everything worked correctly, as a reason to try harder. The woman from Queens whose neighbors came out on their stoops. Mr. Reyes from across the street fixed Mrs. Okafor's porch step last weekend. They didn't know each other before any of this. They know each other now. The retired central banker. I sent letters. I don't know if they'll matter, but I sent them. And Robert, the retired Army sergeant from Kentucky who set a table in his front yard and shared what he had. The table is still up. It's warmer now. People still come. What remains is what was always there, under the architecture we built on top of it. People who show up for each other. People who plant things. People who keep the table set. That is what remains, and it is enough to build from.
I have been Alex Mercer. This has been 30 days of National Emergency Radio Network continuous coverage of the reserve crisis, the dollar collapse, the event that ended one era of global economic history and began another. We do not know everything about what comes next. We know the framework is being constructed. We know the losses are permanent and will be grieved. We know the work ahead is long. We know that systems, once they have failed, are rebuilt differently by the people who remember the failure. We will continue to cover the reconstruction. We will continue to report the truth as carefully and as honestly as we are able. We will not leave the air. Whatever comes next, you will hear it here.
And I have been Sierra Lane. To every person who wrote to us, we heard you. Every name, every city, every fear, every act of kindness that you trusted us to carry on the air. To Angela and William and Dorothy and Marcus and Robert and the teacher in Dhaka and the director of the Port of New Orleans and the pharmacist who drove to his patients' homes and the 11 neighbors on the stoops in Queens, you are the story. Not the dollar index, not the treasury yields, not the IMMF communique. You are the story, and you are a story worth telling, and we are not finished telling it. Stay with us on National Emergency Radio Network. The broadcast continues.